Sleep paralysis. Every culture on Earth has a story about a demon that sits on your chest at night. But the genuinely unsettling thing about it is that they all came up with it independent of each other. Because the demon is real, in a sense, this is sleep paralysis, and it's the condition that happens when your brain wakes up before your body does, which sounds harmless until you actually feel that thing sitting on your chest. But this thing happens because during REM sleep, your muscles are paralyzed on purpose so you don't act out your dreams and kick a hole in the wall. Normally, that paralysis lifts the moment you regain consciousness, but in sleep paralysis, it sticks around for up to a few minutes while you're fully awake and aware that you cannot move a single muscle. And because the brain is still half marinating in REM, the dream content doesn't fully shut off either, which means you start hallucinating while paralyzed in your own bed. Common symptoms include weird sounds like static, voices whispering, screaming, growling, and the unmistakable sensation of, again, that something is pressing down on your chest hard enough to stop you from breathing. A lot of people also report a dark figure standing in the room, which the internet has affectionately nicknamed the sleep paralysis demon. Now, there's more to this folklore, because the word nightmare itself comes from an Old English term, mare, which originally referred to the demon. Egyptians blamed it on a jinn, the Japanese called the experience kanashibari, which translates to metal binding, and Newfoundlanders refer to victims as being hag-ridden by an entity called the Old Hag. Italy alone has like 7 different regional versions, including my personal favorite, a witch who can be defeated by leaving a bag of beans next to your bed because she'll get distracted counting them. Meanwhile, in the United States, where everything has to be sci-fi, sleep paralysis often gets reinterpreted as alien abduction, or in the analog horror version, the boiled one phenomenon. Capgras Delusion. Imagine looking at your spouse of 30 years and being completely, viscerally certain that they have been replaced by an identical imposter wearing their face. That is Capgras Delusion, and it is somehow as terrifying for the person experiencing it as it is for everyone around them. The condition was first documented in 1923 by French psychiatrist Joseph Capgras, who described a woman called Madame M, which was later translated to Madame Macabre, who insisted that doubles had taken the places of her husband and basically everyone else in her life. He originally called the condition l'illusion des sourcils, which translates to the illusion of doppelgangers. For decades, doctors assumed it was a psychiatric thing, probably hysteria, and probably a woman problem, which is roughly the medical establishment's default diagnosis for any condition before 1980. It wasn't until much later that they figured out it's actually mostly caused by neurodegenerative damage, brain injury, dementia with Lewy bodies, schizophrenia, and in one isolated incident, a healthy person taking ketamine. The current best theory around this is that face recognition runs on 2 separate pathways in your brain, one that recognizes the face visually and one that produces the emotional gut feeling of familiarity when you look at someone you love. In Capgras patients, the visual pathway works fine, but the emotional one is severed. So you see your wife, you know objectively that she looks exactly like your wife, but the feeling of "this is my wife" never arrives, and the brain compensates for that gap by deciding the most reasonable explanation is identity theft. Symptoms include refusing to talk to the imposter, paranoia, anger, and in some cases, attempting to physically attack the loved one they're convinced is a fake. Now, if you're stuck in an analog horror series, that person is most likely actually fake. But this is real life, and it makes Capgras Delusion one of the most heartbreaking to live with and genuinely dangerous to be around. Fregoli Delusion. Leopoldo Fregoli was a turn-of-the-century Italian stage actor famous for his ridiculous ability to change costumes and characters within seconds during a single performance. The psychiatric condition named after him takes that gimmick and weaponizes it against the human brain. Fregoli delusion is the belief that different people are actually a single person in disguise, usually someone hostile who is following you, persecuting you, and continually changing their appearance to mess with you. So while Capgras patients believe one person has become many imposters, Fregoli patients believe many people are secretly one imposter. It is, in every meaningful way, the exact opposite delusion. The condition was first documented in 1927 by 2 French researchers who described a 27-year-old woman in London convinced that 2 actors she'd seen at the theatre were stalking her by taking the forms of every person she encountered. Now, that's one of the symptoms, but the causes tend to be physical rather than purely psychiatric. Brain injuries to the right frontal lobe or the left temporoparietal area can trigger it. Damage to the fusiform gyrus, the part of the brain that specifically processes faces, has been heavily implicated, and long-term use of levodopa, a Parkinson's drug, can also produce the delusion as a side effect. Your brain on dopamine treatments apparently decides that everyone you meet is the same guy in a hat. There's even a variant called Fregoli for environment, where the patient believes their current unfamiliar location, like a hospital, has secretly been transformed into a familiar place like their home or workplace. Exploding head syndrome. The name sounds like a Cronenberg movie, but the condition itself is just as terrible as it sounds. Exploding head syndrome is what happens when you're drifting off to sleep or just starting to wake up and your brain suddenly hits you with the sound of a gunshot, a thunderclap, a roar, a chord on an instrument that doesn't exist, or sometimes just a really aggressive pop. There's no actual pain involved and nothing in your body is actually changing. The noise just happens inside your head somewhere in the brief no man's land between consciousness and sleep. But it's loud enough that a lot of people genuinely believe they're having a stroke or that someone has broken into their bedroom. About 10% of people experience it at some point, sometimes once in a lifetime, sometimes several times in a single night. Some sufferers also see a flash of light alongside the sound, and others report a weird tingling sensation crawling up the body before the noise arrives, like a horror movie jump scare with built-in foreshadowing. The current best theory is that the reticular formation, the part of your brainstem responsible for handing you off between waking and sleeping, temporarily breaks down on the job. But instead of gradually dimming your neural activity, it lets out one final disorganized burst, which your auditory cortex then interprets as a loud sound that wasn't actually there. The first medical write-up of the syndrome dates back to 1876, when a doctor named Silas Weir Mitchell described it as sensory discharges and theorized that the cause was smoking, because in 1876, the cause of basically everything was either smoking or whatever the heck the current thing was back then. The phrase exploding head syndrome itself was coined in 1989 by British neurologist John Pearce. Boanthropy. Of all the ways the human brain can break, this is the one that specifically involves becoming convinced that you are a cow. Boanthropy is a delusional condition in which a person believes themselves to be a bovine and behaves accordingly, eating grass, mooing, refusing to make eye contact during quarterly meetings, and it has been documented for thousands of years. The most famous case is biblical. The Book of Daniel describes King Nebuchadnezzar II of the Neo-Babylonian Empire being driven from men and did eat grass as oxen, which is generally accepted as the earliest written description of boanthropy. Carl Jung later analyzed Nebuchadnezzar as a man who had overreached himself and regressed entirely as a result. There's also a Persian account of the Buyid prince Majd al-Dawla, who developed the delusion that he was a cow, started making cow noises, and earnestly requested that his subjects butcher him so his flesh could be consumed for nourishment. He was eventually cured by the philosopher and physician Avicenna, who, if you don't know, is one of the greatest, if not the greatest Muslim philosopher of all time. So it's safe to say that it took a goat to talk someone out of being a cow. The condition is generally grouped under the broader umbrella of clinical lycanthropy, the psychiatric category for delusions in which a person believes they have transformed into an animal, and it tends to show up alongside schizophrenia, psychotic depression, or bipolar disorder, rather than as a standalone diagnosis. There are also physiological causes that have been proposed, including porphyria and late-stage syphilis, both of which can wreck the brain badly enough to produce some pretty tragic delusions. Charles Bonnet syndrome. When a person loses a limb, the brain sometimes refuses to accept the limb is gone and keeps firing signals to it anyway, producing the phenomenon known as phantom limb pain. Charles Bonnet syndrome is the exact same idea, but applied to vision. The condition occurs in people who have lost some or all of their sight due to conditions like age-related macular degeneration, glaucoma, or diabetic retinopathy. The brain, deprived of the visual input it expects to receive, tries to cope and starts inventing content to fill the silence. This produces highly detailed visual hallucinations that can range from simple repeating patterns and geometric shapes to landscapes, animals, insects, fully detailed strangers in vintage costumes, and occasionally creatures from outright fantasy like dragons and unicorns. The most common hallucination is faces or cartoons. Crucially, the person experiencing this knows the hallucinations are not real, which separates Charles Bonnet from psychiatric conditions and makes it more of a sensory glitch than a mental illness. The hallucinations tend to last from a few seconds to several hours, often appear when the person first wakes up and stop the moment they shift their gaze. The condition was first documented by Swiss naturalist Charles Bonnet in 1760, who described it occurring in his nearly blind 87-year-old grandfather following bilateral cataract surgery. The grandfather's vision deteriorated, and shortly after, he began seeing carriages, tapestries, and many other things that weren't there. Bonnet himself eventually developed severe vision loss of his own at age 40 and started experiencing the hallucinations firsthand, which makes him both the namesake of the condition and one of its most famous patients. Pareidolia. Every time you've ever spotted a face in a cloud, in a tree trunk, in a wood grain, in the front grille of a car, or in the random arrangement of 3 holes in an electrical outlet, you've been doing this. Pareidolia is the tendency for the human brain to perceive meaningful patterns, especially faces, in completely random visual or auditory noise. It's a specific subtype of apophenia, which is the broader tendency to see meaningful connections where none actually exist. The word comes from Greek roots that translate roughly to alongside an image, which is doing a lot of polite work for what is essentially your brain is making things up. Functional MRI studies have shown that when people look at a face-like pattern, the fusiform face area, the same brain region that processes actual human faces, lights up within 165 milliseconds, almost as quickly as it does for real faces. So your brain is genuinely treating that smiling outlet as a person before your conscious mind has a chance to weigh in. The reason this exists evolutionarily is that natural selection rewards the people who can spot a hidden predator or a hostile stranger fast enough to react, and being slightly oversensitive to face detection is a small price to pay for not getting eaten in the savannah. The condition correlates with age and is particularly frequent in patients with Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia. Pareidolia is also why people see the Virgin Mary on a grilled cheese sandwich, the devil in the smoke of the September 11th attacks, hidden words in the Shroud of Turin, an alien face on the surface of Mars, and rabbits on the moon. Leonardo da Vinci specifically recommended pareidolia as a creative tool for painters, advising them to stare at stained walls until imagery emerged from the patterns. Jamais vu. Most people are at least vaguely familiar with déjà vu, the brief, unsettling sense that you've already lived through whatever moment you're currently in. Jamais vu is its evil twin. French for never seen, jamais vu is the experience of looking at something deeply familiar, your own house, your spouse's face, a word you've used your whole life, and having your brain briefly fail to recognize it. You know objectively that you should know what you're looking at, but for a moment, you just don't. Examples include walking into your own living room and feeling like you've stepped into a stranger's home, or staring at a perfectly normal word like door until it suddenly looks misspelled and wrong, like a foreign language someone made up to mess with you. The cause is a momentary miscommunication between the temporal lobes, which handle recognition, and the hippocampus, which handles memory, basically the same circuit that produces déjà vu, just running in reverse. Triggers include sleep deprivation, mental fatigue, intense stress, migraines, and certain forms of temporal lobe epilepsy, where jamais vu can actually be the only visible sign that a seizure is occurring. The most famous experiment on jamais vu was done at Leeds University by a researcher named Chris Moulin, who asked 92 volunteers to write the word door 30 times in 60 seconds. 68% of them started doubting that door was a real word. Moulin's theory is that the same kind of brain fatigue underlying jamais vu might be responsible for some of the symptoms in schizophrenia and Capgras Delusion, meaning the things at the start of this list might just be permanent versions of the thing at the end. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe. And if there's any video idea you want me to cover, drop it in the comments. I always check them out. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.